Greetings, Lawmasters. Tonight, our chronicle covers a conflict that tore the throat of the world apart, yet somehow felt smaller than a tavern brawl. We're returning to the frost-bitten provinces of the north, to the land of jagged peaks, ancient barrows, and mead halls that smell perpetually of wet dog and roasted venison. Tonight, we look at the Civil War of Skyrim, the event that was supposed to define the Fourth Era, but ended up feeling more like a heated argument between two grumpy neighbours over a property line. The wind here cuts through even the thickest fur armour, whistling through the gaps in the stone like a mourning mother. The scent of iron and pine hangs heavy in the air, a reminder that this land is beautiful, deadly, and entirely indifferent to your survival. Let's be honest, you probably wouldn't survive a trip to Cold Harbour without some serious enchanted gear, and you'd likely catch ataxia just from looking at a skeever the wrong way. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what time the clock reads in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Dragonborn stands upon the precipice of High Hrothgar, looking down upon the sprawling tundra of Whiterun Hold. In the lore, in the grand tapestry of the Elder Scrolls history, this view should be marred by the smoke of encampments and the flash of steel. The Civil War is described in the history books as a bloody fratricidal tear in the Empire's side. It is the culmination of decades of tension following the Great War, a theological and political schism that pits brother against brother, Greymane against Battleborn, the immovable object of Imperial bureaucracy against the unstoppable force of Nord nationalism. When you read the in-game books, particularly the harrowing accounts found in the Great War, you're treated to descriptions of legions manoeuvring, magical barrages that decimate entire battalions, and the sheer, overwhelming cost of conflict on a continental scale. The mental image painted by the writers at Bethesda is one of grandeur, tragedy, and epic scope. However, as the Dragonborn descends the 7,000 steps, dodging the occasional frost troll that has decided to camp on the Holy Path, the reality of the game engine begins to set in. The grand promise of a civil war that ravages the province is immediately at odds with the bland reality of the world as it is rendered. The roads are shockingly empty. The great conflict that General Tullius and Jarl Ulfric Stormcloak scream about in their respective palaces manifests in the open world as three guys in red leather armour vaguely poking three guys in blue quilted vests with iron swords. It isn't a war. It is a series of isolated, low-stakes bar fights that occasionally spill out onto the cobblestones. This disconnect is the first and arguably the most jarring reason why this questline fails to land. The narrative weight placed upon the Dragonborn's shoulders suggests that the fate of Tamriel hangs in the balance. You are the deciding factor, the thumb on the scale of history, yet the scale itself feels incredibly small. The province of Skyrim, for all its beauty, the way the Aurora Borealis dances over the throat of the world, or the way the sunlight hits the waterfalls of the Reach, feels sparsely populated to the point of desolation. Consider the established lore regarding the Imperial Legion. The Empire, even in its weakened state following the White Gold Concordat, is a massive military machine. We know from previous games and lore texts that a single legion consists of roughly 5,000 soldiers. General Tullius was sent north to quell a rebellion, and while it is mentioned that the Pale Pass is blocked by avalanches, a convenient narrative excuse for why reinforcements are scarce, the local forces he commands are pitifully few. You can walk from Solitude to Riften, traversing the entire breadth of the country, and encounter perhaps 2 patrols, and when these patrols meet, the AI doesn't execute complex tactics. They don't flank, they don't use cover. They simply run at each other in straight lines, shouting the same 3 lines of dialogue until one side runs out of health points. It is less the art of war and more a chaotic mosh pit at a Bard's College recital. There is a fascinating, somewhat obscure lore tidbit that highlights this discrepancy between lore and gameplay. In the book The Holdings of Jarl Jarland, which dates back to the First Era, there are lists of settlements and fortifications that imply a population density and military infrastructure far beyond what we see in the Fourth Era. While time erodes civilizations, the sheer emptiness of Skyrim's military presence feels less like a result of historical decline and more like a result of console RAM limitations circa 2011. The game asks you to believe that Whiterun is a major trade hub and strategic key to the north, yet its garrison consists of maybe 20 guards who spend more time complaining about sweet rolls than drilling for a siege. The community has spent years debating this scale theory. This is the fan theory that posits the Skyrim we play is merely a metaphorical representation of the real Skyrim in the lore. In the real world, Whiterun is a city of thousands. The trek from Riverwood takes days, and the battles involve thousands of soldiers. But because we're playing a video game, everything is condensed. While this theory helps soothe the aching heart of the immersion-seeking role-player, it doesn't excuse the fact that the Civil War questline relies on the player's imagination to do the heavy lifting that the game engine refuses to do. We are told it is a war. We are shown a skirmish. The tragedy of this bland reality is that it undermines the urgency. Why should the Dragonborn care about picking a side? If the Stormcloaks are just a ragtag group of farmers who can barely hold a fort against a pack of wolves, and the Empire is just a handful of tired administrators who would rather be in Cyrodiil, the stakes evaporate. The emotional core of the conflict, the idea that families are being torn apart, is hard to buy when the only evidence of this family strife is a couple of rude conversations in the Battleborn house. Furthermore, the mechanics of these open-world encounters are often inadvertently hilarious, shattering whatever dark mood the scriptwriters tried to cultivate. You might stumble upon a skirmish in the Pale, where snow falls thick and heavy. The music swells, indicating danger. You draw your weapon, ready to intervene in this historic struggle. Suddenly a courier, clad only in a tunic and boots, runs directly through the middle of the sword fight, ignoring the lethal steel swinging inches from his face, just to hand you a letter from a Jarl who wants you to buy a plot of land. The war doesn't pause for the world, and the world certainly doesn't pause for the war. The AI routines for the war are just another layer of radiant noise, indistinguishable from a bandit attack or a bear encounter. This leads us to the fundamental issue of show, don't tell. Bethesda is famous for environmental storytelling. The skeleton reaching for a potion it couldn't drink in time, the lover's camp crushed by a rockfall. They are masters of static storytelling. But the Civil War required dynamic storytelling. It required the world to change, for lines of battle to shift, for the roads to become dangerous not because of random spawns, but because of strategic movements. Instead, we got static camps. The Imperial and Stormcloak camps dotted around the map are another example of this bland reality. They are essentially unkillable zones. You can walk into an opposing camp, slaughter the generic soldiers, and then find yourself beating on an essential unkillable legate or Stormcloak commander who just drops to one knee, catches their breath, and stands up again. It reinforces the idea that nothing you do outside of the specific scripted quest nodes matters. You cannot win the war through attrition. You cannot decapitate the enemy leadership through a daring solo raid. The game puts up invisible walls and essential tags telling you, no, you must follow the script, you must wait for the quest marker. For a game that sells itself on ultimate freedom, the freedom to go anywhere, be anyone, the Civil War is a railroaded experience with the windows painted over to look like a battlefield. Even the wildlife seems to have more tactical acumen than the soldiers. Mudcrabs will at least try to bury themselves to ambush you. The soldiers of the Civil War are visually impressive in their uniforms, but mechanically they are hollow shells. The clash of red and blue is purely cosmetic, and when you strip away the dragon shouts and the magical gear, and you stand there watching two NPCs slowly whittle down each other's health bars in a synchronized animation loop that looks like they are churning butter rather than fighting for their lives, the illusion breaks. The grand promise was a clash of ideologies, a gritty, grounded conflict in a world of high fantasy. The reality is that the Civil War is the least interesting thing happening in Skyrim at any given moment. A dragon attacking a giant is more cinematic. A thief running from a guard is more dynamic. The Civil War feels like a placeholder for a system that was never finished. It is a ghost of a feature, a skeletal framework that lacks the muscle and sinew of a real conflict. The Dragonborn is promised the chance to be a general, a conqueror, a liberator. But right from the start, as you wander the empty road seeing nothing but elk and the occasional aggressive goat, you realise that the title of Hero of the War is just going to be another notch on your belt. No different than Thane of Morthal or Archmage of a college you visited twice. The grand tapestry is threadbare, and as we pull at this loose thread, the whole sweater begins to unravel. If the open world is where the illusion of a grand war goes to die, then Helgen is where the lie was first beautifully crafted. We have to go back to the beginning, to that grey, misty morning that every single one of us has experienced more times than we care to admit. The screen fades from black, the sound of wooden wheels trundling over uneven cobblestones fills your ears, and Ralof delivers the line that launched 1,000 memes. "Hey you, you're finally awake." It is arguably the most iconic opening in modern RPG history, but beyond the cultural impact, it serves as a masterclass in setting a narrative tone that the rest of the Civil War questline frantically tries and fails to match. In those opening 15 minutes, the Civil War feels incredibly dangerous. It feels visceral. You're not a hero, you're a prisoner, bound at the wrists, jostling in a cart with a horse thief, a rebellion leader, and a soldier who has accepted his fate. The air in Helgen is thick with tension. Not the abstract political tension of Solitude's court, but the immediate, sweaty fear of impending death. You look at Ulfric's Stormcloak, gagged and staring forward with intense, brooding eyes, and you understand without a single line of exposition that this man is dangerous. The Empire is terrified of his voice. That singular detail, the gag, does more to build the myth of the Thuum and the stakes of the rebellion than hours of dialogue later in the game. This sequence is the false dawn of narrative depth. It promises a story where actions have immediate lethal consequences. There is no radiant AI here, no wandering couriers. This is a tightly scripted cinematic experience. When the cart stops and the roll call begins, the bureaucracy of the Empire is on full display. You're not on the list. It's a clerical error. But the captain, tired and indifferent to justice, orders you to the block anyway. Forget the list. He goes to the block. It is a chilling moment that perfectly encapsulates the ruthless efficiency and the moral rot of the Imperial Legion. It makes you, the player, feel small, helpless, and personally aggrieved. It gives you a reason to care. The execution of the nameless Stormcloak soldier before you is brutal. There is no fanfare, no glorious last stand, just a head rolling into a basket. The sound design here is gruesome, a wet thud that signals to the player, this is war, people die here. For a brief moment, Skyrim feels gritty. It feels like a dark fantasy novel where plot armor doesn't exist. The game is telling you that the Civil War is a meat grinder, and you are just fresh meat. There is a fascinating, often overlooked detail in this opening sequence that hints at a much more complex political web than we ever get to see again. If you pay very close attention to the background, while the priestess of Arche is droning on about the 8 divines, you can spot Elenwen, the first emissary of the Thalmor, arguing with General Tullius. Most players miss this on their first run, focused as they are on the headsman's axe, but this obscure lore tidbit is crucial. Elenwen is actually there to stop the execution. The Thalmor Dossier found later in the game confirms that they want the war to continue to weaken the Empire. Executing Ulfric effectively ends the war before it begins, which is the last thing the High Elves want. Tullius, showing a rare moment of competence and defiance against his Thalmor overseers, is rushing the execution to get it done before they can intervene legally. It creates a delicious layer of political intrigue. The Empire and the Thalmor are technically allies, yet playing a 4D chess game with Ulfric's life. But then the dragon screams, Alduin descends, bringing fire and chaos, and the false dawn begins to fade into the bland reality we discussed earlier. The moment you escape Helgen, the narrative tension snaps like a dry twig. You emerge from the cave, blinking in the sunlight, and suddenly the urgency is gone. The game tells you to go to Riverwood, but it doesn't make you. You can turn left and go hunt elk for 6 months. You can go pick flowers in Falkreath. The man who was just seconds away from decapitating you is now a distant memory, and the civil war that seemed to be consuming the world is suddenly invisible. The choice you make inside the keep, to follow Ralof or Hadvar, is presented as a monumental decision. It frames the conflict as a binary path: the scrappy traditionalist underdog or the orderly cosmopolitan empire. In the heat of the burning village, the stone walls crumble and fire rains from the sky. Choosing who to trust feels like a life or death decision. You're bonding with a soldier in the trenches. But this intimacy is deceptive. Once you leave the cave, Hadvar or Ralof essentially become generic NPCs until you meet them again much later. The deep bond forged in fire is replaced by a standard quest marker. The emotional momentum of Helgen is squandered because the game engine cannot sustain that level of intensity across a map the size of a small country. This transition from the scripted intro to the open sandbox highlights the core problem. The Civil War needs to be a story of momentum, but Bethesda games are designed for distraction. The pacing is shattered the moment the player is given control. You're told, the Jarl needs to know about this dragon, and the war is escalating, but the mechanics tell you, here is a crafting station, why not make 400 iron daggers? The dissonance is deafening. There is a popular, somewhat humorous fan theory regarding this sequence known as the Lokier of Rorikstead maneuver. Fans debate whether Lokier, the horse thief who runs and gets shot by archers, actually inadvertently saved the world. The theory goes that his frantic prayers to the divines, specifically calling out to Akatosh moments before he dies, actually summoned Alduin. "Akatosh, please help. Me," he screams, and minutes later the firstborn of Akatosh appears. Did the dragon god of time answer the prayer of a lowly horse thief in the most monkey's paw way possible? While likely just coincidence, the community clings to these theories because they add a layer of mystical cause and effect that the actual main quest lacks. It suggests a universe where actions, even frantic prayers, have consequences, which is a feeling the rest of the Civil War questline desperately lacks. As the dragon flies away and you trudge down the path to Riverwood, the disconnect settles in. You've just survived a legendary event. You have witnessed the return of the World Eater and the near execution of a king. Yet, the first guard you meet in Riverwood will likely complain about his cousin being out fighting dragons while he got stuck with guard duty. The world does not react to Helgen the way it should. The smoke rising from the destroyed town should be a beacon of fear for the whole hold. Refugees should be clogging the roads. Instead, life goes on with an eerie, static calmness. The Helgen sequence writes a check that the Civil War cannot cash. It sets up a story of high political stakes, personal vendettas, and the looming threat of Thalmor manipulation. It promises that the Dragonborn will be a pivotal figure in a complex web of alliances. But as we'll see, the role of the Dragonborn quickly devolves from a survivor of history to a glorified errand boy. The nuance of Elenwen's presence is forgotten. The brutality of the execution block is replaced by bloodless skirmishes. The narrative depth was a mirage, a set-piece designed to look good in trailers, leaving us with a hollow feeling as we step into the vast, beautiful and ultimately shallow pond of the actual war. From the ashes of Helgen, the Dragonborn eventually finds themselves standing before the leaders of their chosen faction, ready to prove their worth. Whether you kneel before the weary, leather-faced General Tullius in Solitude or the charismatic, deep-voiced Ulfric in Windhelm, the task assigned to you is identical. They need a symbol. They need the Jagged Crown. In the lore, this artifact is the stuff of legends, a crown forged from the bones and teeth of dragons, said to contain the might of the ancient Nords. It is the ultimate symbol of legitimacy. Whoever wears the Jagged Crown isn't just a warlord, they are the High King by ancient right. The narrative build-up here is heavy. You expect an odyssey, a trial that tests your spirit and your command. Instead, what you get is a glorified fetch quest that feels mechanically identical to clearing out a generic bandit cave to retrieve a family heirloom or a lost sweet roll. The destination is Korvenjund, a Nordic ruin buried deep in the snowdrifts of the Pale. The exterior assault is arguably the high point of the quest. You meet a squad of your faction's soldiers, Galmar Stonefist or Legate Ricker leading the charge. There is a brief, chaotic skirmish with the enemy outside the massive stone doors. Arrows fly, steel clashes, and for a fleeting moment as you charge up the snowy steps stepping over fresh corpses, it feels like a military operation. But the moment those heavy doors groan open and the loading screen fades, the illusion collapses back into the standard Skyrim dungeon crawling loop. The Jagged Crown quest suffers from being indistinguishable from the Radiant quests you've been doing for hours. You sneak through drafty corridors, you deactivate tripwires that swing spiked logs into your face, and you fight waves of Draugr. The only difference is that this time you have a handful of essential NPCs cluttering the hallways, getting in your way, and repeating the same combat barks. "Skyrim belongs to the Nords," or "For the Empire," echoes off the stone walls until the words lose all meaning. It doesn't feel like a race against time to secure the future of the throne. It feels like a guided tour of a crypt where the tour guides are incredibly violent. Let's pause to appreciate the object itself, because the lore behind the Jagged Crown is actually metal as hell. This isn't just a fancy hat. It dates back to the First Era and King Borgus. Here is your obscure lore tidbit for the night. King Borgus was the last of the line of Ysgramor. He was a devout follower of the Alessian Order, a fanatical religious sect that hated elves. Borgus actually died in Valenwood, far from the snows of Skyrim. He was travelling there to urge the Bosmer to join a war against the High Elves. Instead, he fell victim to the Wild Hunt, a terrifying ritual where wood elves transform into a chaotic horde of shifting, cannibalistic beasts. Borgus was torn apart and consumed. His body was secretly brought back to Skyrim and interred in Corvinjund with the crown. Knowing that this item was pulled from the wreckage of a king who was eaten by shape-shifting elves adds a layer of grim history that the game barely whispers about. Back in the gameplay reality, however, you are trudging through the ruin and you hit the inevitable puzzle door. You know the one, the ebony claw door. The combination is on the claw itself. By this point in the game, the Dragonborn has solved enough of these to qualify as a master locksmith, but the military leaders accompanying you are baffled. Look for a switch, they mutter, wandering aimlessly while you rotate the rings. It diminishes the feeling of being among elite soldiers. Galmar Stonefist is supposed to be a veteran of 1,000 battles, yet he is defeated by a picture-matching puzzle intended to keep out mindless zombies. When you finally reach the burial chamber, the Draugr Deathlord wearing the crown awakens. This should be a boss fight for the ages. This creature is an ancient king's guardian, or perhaps Borgus himself reanimated. But because you have backup, the fight is usually a messy pile-on. The majestic tension of a one-on-one duel is lost as 5 soldiers dogpile the Draugr, spamming power attacks until he ragdolls into a corner. You loot the crown from the corpse, and here lies the greatest tragedy of this quest. The crown looks incredible. It is unique, jagged, primal, and visually distinct from every other helmet in the game. It looks fantastic on the Dragonborn. It fits the aesthetic of a legendary hero perfectly. But the quest demands you give it up immediately. You're merely the delivery driver. You carry the burger, you don't get to eat it. This frustration sparked a massive community debate and led to one of the most famous exploits in the game's history. Players refused to accept that they couldn't keep the coolest hat in the province. Fans figured out that if you reverse pickpocket the crown onto Ralof or Hadvar after finding it, but before the quest updates to deliver the crown, you can technically complete the quest, while the item stays in the NPC's inventory. Later, you can pickpocket it back from them at the Riverwood Sleeping Giant Inn or the Riverwood Blacksmith. It's a glitch, a break in the code, but it speaks to a deeper failure in the quest design. The players felt more ownership over the symbol of power than the actual claimants to the throne. The community decided that the Dragonborn, the Slayer of Alduin, had more right to wear the bones of dragons than Ulfric or Elisif ever did. The delivery of the crown is the final nail in the coffin of excitement. You return to the Palace of Kings or the Blue Palace. You approach the throne. You hand over this artifact that costs lives to retrieve. The Jarl takes it. They might say a line or two about how this changes everything, but does it? Does the world shift? No. The crown disappears into their inventory, never to be seen again unless you use console commands. Ulfric doesn't wear it during normal gameplay. Tullius certainly doesn't wear it. It vanishes into the void. The Jagged Crown serves as a microcosm for the entire Civil War experience, a build-up of immense lore significance, a gameplay loop of standard dungeon crawling, and a resolution that changes nothing in the visible world. It is a MacGuffin in the purest, most disappointing sense. It drives the plot forward, but it has no intrinsic value to the world simulation. You don't see morale improve. You don't see enemy lords defecting because Ulfric holds the crown. You just get a pat on the head, a levelled piece of armour as a reward, and the next order to go report to a camp in the middle of nowhere. Contrast this with other RPGs where retrieving a legendary item grants you a new power or shifts the political landscape visibly. In Skyrim, the Jagged Crown is just a heavy key that unlocks the next phase of the quest script. The grand promise was that you were restoring a lineage or proving the Empire's dominance. The bland reality is that you were just doing some pest control in a tomb so your boss could have a shiny paperweight. As the Dragonborn walks out of the palace, leaving the crown behind, the hollow feeling returns. You are the most powerful being on the continent, yet you're treated like a glorified retriever. and unfortunately as we move to the next phase of the war, this feeling of being an overqualified errand runner only intensifies. The crown was at least a unique item. What comes next is a descent into the mundane bureaucracy of war, where the Dragonborn trades their sword for a satchel and their shout for a polite knock on the door. The Jagged Crown has been delivered. The rightful ruler has their symbol of office. You, the Dragonborn, have proven that you can navigate a Nordic ruin and hit things with a sharp piece of metal. Now surely the real war begins. Now the leaders of your faction will entrust you with command, with strategy, with leading a battalion into the teeth of enemy fire. You stand ready, chest swelling with pride, waiting for the order to siege a city or cut off a supply line. Instead, General Tullius, or Ulfric Stormcloak, looks at you, the person who eats dragon souls for breakfast, and says essentially, "I need you to take this letter to a guy in Whiterun. Welcome to the message to Whiterun phase of the Civil War, or as I like to call it, the Dragonborn as glorified courier." This is the moment where the narrative disconnect becomes so wide you could fly a dragon through it. You are the Dovahkiin. You can shout the sky clear of clouds. You are the Thane of multiple holds. And yet, the most critical task the military genius of your faction can find for you is mail delivery. It is a humbling and frankly insulting reduction of the player's agency. The quest is simple. Take an axe, if you're a Stormcloak, or a letter, if you're an Imperial, to Jarl Balgruuf the Greater in Whiterun. In Nord culture, giving an axe to a rival Jarl is a specific non-verbal challenge. If they keep the axe, it means peace, or at least a delay of conflict. If they return the axe, it means war. It's a cool bit of cultural flavour, a core in-game fact that adds some depth to Nord diplomacy. But mechanically, it involves fast travelling to Dragon's Reach, walking up to Balgruuf, handing him the item, and then waiting. You wait while Balgruuf talks to his advisors. You wait while he paces around. You wait while he has a long, drawn-out conversation with Proventus, Avenici and Irileth about the dangers of dragons versus the dangers of Ulfric. You are a spectator in your own story. The game forces you to stand there like a child waiting for their parents to stop arguing so they can sign a permission slip. This section of the questline highlights a major flaw in the pacing, the illusion of urgency versus the reality of bureaucracy. The dialogue suggests that time is of the essence. Go now, they say, Balgruuf must decide. But nothing happens until you arrive. The war is paused. The fate of Whiterun, the central trading hub of the province, is entirely dependent on how fast you decide to jog up the steps to the Cloud District, which, as Nazim reminds us, we don't visit often enough. But the absurdity peaks with the Quentin Scipius factor. If you sided with the Imperials, you're often tasked with delivering false orders or intercepting couriers. This leads to the infamous A False Front quest. You have to find a Stormcloak courier, kill him, take his documents, and then have them forged. It sounds like spycraft. It sounds exciting. In reality, it involves looking at your map, finding the arrow that is moving slowly along a road, and fast travelling to the nearest inn to cut him off. The obscure lore tidbit here is found in the documents you intercept. If you actually read the Stormcloak courier's missive, it often details requests for reinforcements at Fort Newgrad or similar locations. But if you cross-reference this with the actual game state, Fort Newgrad is usually empty or occupied by bandits until the specific quest to take it triggers. The lore in the letter describes a dynamic, moving front line with supply issues and troop movements. The game world shows a static fort with 3 skeletons in the basement. The text is writing a check the engine cannot cash. The courier is carrying orders for phantom soldiers who do not exist until the script spawns them. This phase of the war also brings up a glaring issue with the Dragonborn's rank. You are technically an auxiliary, or a low-ranking officer at this point. But you are treated with a bizarre mix of reverence and subservience. Rikke or Galmar will call you unblooded, or bonebreaker, depending on your progress, but they still order you around like a fresh recruit. There is no sense of rising through the ranks. In Morrowind or Oblivion, faction advancement felt earned. You had to have certain stats. You had to perform specific duties. In Skyrim, you just have to show up. You are the chosen one, so the rules of military hierarchy don't apply, except when it comes to doing the grunt work. The community has long mocked this courier-born phenomenon. There are endless memes about the Dragonborn slaying a literal god-eater 1 minute, and then being told, "Here, take this letter to the Jarl and don't dawdle." It breaks the power fantasy. It reminds you that you're playing a video game where quests are dispensed by vending machine NPCs. A true war simulation would have you commanding troops, or at least sitting in on the war council as an equal. Instead, you are the legman. You are the person they send because they can't spare a real soldier. Think about the implications. If the Dragonborn gets eaten by a bear on the way to Whiterun, the entire war effort stalls. General Tullius sits in solitude, staring at the door, wondering why Balgruuf hasn't replied. The war doesn't adapt, it waits. This static nature turns the Dragonborn from a catalyst of change into the only moving part in a rusted machine. Eventually, Balgruuf makes his decision. He hands the axe back, or refuses the Imperial terms initially leading to the defence. "Take this to Ulfric," he says. And so, you turn around and fast travel back. You're a ping-pong ball bouncing between two stubborn old men. The dialogue is grave, serious, laden with the die is cast metaphors, but the gameplay is just walking. This section is the lull before the storm, but it's a lull that lasts too long and asks too little. It exposes the lack of non-combat mechanics in the civil war. There is no diplomacy minigame. You can't use your speech skill to convince Balgruuf to join your side earlier. You can't intimidate him. You can't bribe Proventus. You're just the messenger. Your high skills in illusion, your mastery of the voice, none of it matters. The script is rigid. Balgruuf will always hesitate. The axe will always be returned. The war will always come to Whiterun. And when it does, when the battle for Whiterun finally triggers, you expect the payoff for all this running around. You expect the siege that was promised. You expect the grand clash of armies that you delivered messages to assemble. But as we will see in the next leg of our journey, the game engine has a very different definition of siege than you do. The Dragonborn puts away the courier bag and draws their sword, only to find that the army they summoned fits comfortably in a single tavern. The courier runs have ended. The axe has been returned, its blade cold and heavy with the promise of violence. The diplomatic channels have closed, replaced by the guttural roar of catapults and the rhythmic thumping of marching boots. We have arrived at the battle for Whiterun, the centrepiece of the Civil War questline. In the marketing materials, in the lore books, and in the fevered imagination of the player, this is the moment where Skyrim becomes a war epic. You picture thousands of soldiers cresting the hill near Pelagia Farm. You imagine the sky darkened by arrows, the walls of the city buckling under the strain of siege engines, and the streets flowing with the blood of patriots and tyrants alike. The reality, however, is what I like to call the skirmish for Whiterun. As the Dragonborn approaches the city, the visual trickery is actually quite competent. From a distance, the sky is choked with black smoke. Fireballs arc through the air, leaving trails of embers before crashing into the landscape. The music shifts to that driving, percussive war theme that makes your heart rate spike just a little. For a few glorious seconds, the creation engine lies to you successfully. It tells you that hell has come to the central hold, but then you get closer. You crest the ridge, weapon drawn, ready to cleave your way through a legion, and you find 10 guys, maybe 12, if the game is feeling generous and your frame rate can handle the strain. The massive army invading the trade capital of Skyrim is smaller than the line for the bathroom at a crowded tavern. The limitations of the hardware at the time, and the engine's notorious instability with large crowds, forced Bethesda to use a conveyor belt system for the battle. Soldiers don't flood the field. They spawn in small waves of 3 or 4 to replace the ones who die. It turns the battlefield into a bizarre, sparse meat grinder, where you often find yourself jogging around looking for someone to hit. The vast open plains of Whiterun, perfect for cavalry charges and shield walls, are empty save for these small pockets of radiant AI slapping each other with steel swords. The siege mechanics themselves are equally baffling. If you're attacking, your objective is to break down the barricades. In a real siege, this would involve battering rams, sappers, or powerful destruction magic. In Skyrim, it involves hitting a wooden fence with your sword until it explodes. The Dragonborn, the Slayer of Dragons, is reduced to doing manual demolition work because the soldiers accompanying you seem confused by the concept of wood. They will stand there, shouting battle cries at a fence, waiting for you to shatter it so they can pathfind to the next checkpoint. There is a core in-game fact here that players often encounter with frustration: the drawbridge. Depending on which side you're on, the drawbridge is either raised or lowered, and the mechanism to control it becomes the focal point of the first phase. It's a classic choke point. But because of the low NPC count, it doesn't feel like a desperate hold against a tide of enemies. It feels like a minor traffic jam. You can stand at the top of the ramparts and watch the army spawn into existence from thin air near the stables, breaking the immersion completely. Once you breach the city, or if you're defending once they breach the gates, the fighting moves into the streets. This should be urban warfare at its most chaotic. Fighting house to house, using the verticality of the Plains District. Instead, the civilians vanish, sensibly, and the city feels like a ghost town populated by infinite guards. The debris is static. Those burning textures on the houses? They are just overlays. You can't put the fires out. The destruction is cosmetic, a theatre set that refuses to interact with the actors. Here is an obscure lore tidbit that adds a touch of genuine tragedy to this mechanical farce. While most civilians hide, there is one scripted casualty of the battle for Whiterun, Severio Pelagia. He is the owner of Pelagia Farm, the first location hit by the attackers. If you visit his farm before the war, he's a grumpy but hard-working old man who sells cabbages and complains about the weather. During the battle, his house is destroyed by a catapult shot. The game script commands him to die. You might find his body later, or he simply vanishes from the game. It's a rare instance where the war has a permanent named consequence. He isn't a soldier, he's just a farmer in the wrong place. It's a poignant detail buried under the clunky mechanics, a ghost of the dark, gritty war story they wanted to tell. The community has spent over a decade debating the Whiterun defensibility theory. Fans argue on forums about the strategic value of Whiterun. The walls are crumbling in places even before the siege. The Dragon's Reach Palace is a fortress, but the lower districts are barely protected. Tacticians in the fanbase point out that a real army would simply starve the city out or flank it, rather than funneling into the narrow death trap of the main gate. The battle tactics displayed by both Tullius and Ulfric here are amateurish at best, relying entirely on the throw bodies at the wall until it breaks strategy. It makes the great leaders of Skyrim look less like generals and more like children smashing action figures together. As you push up through the districts, past the drunken huntsmen, past the market stalls that are now mysteriously indestructible obstacles, the pacing begins to drag. The infinite spawning means there is no sense of progress unless you keep moving. You can kill 500 Stormcloaks in the market square, and they will keep coming. You have to push the invisible front line forward by walking. The war is won not by attrition, but by the Dragonborn's physical location triggering the next script. Finally, you reach Dragon's Reach. The music swells, the heavy doors open, and suddenly, the war stops. Inside the great porch, the Jarl and his advisors are usually standing around waiting for you. If you are attacking, there's a final boss fight, which consists of beating Balgruuf and Irileth into submission. Seeing the Jarl of Whiterun, a man you likely respect, drop to one knee and gasp for mercy is intended to be a heavy moment. "I surrender," he wheezes. "Garrus, tell the men to stand down." But the transition is jarring. 1 second, you are slaughtering generic soldiers outside. The next, you are having a civilized, albeit tense, political conversation. The blood on your sword hasn't even dried, and already the game is resetting to peaceful NPC mode. The siege doesn't taper off, it snaps shut. The aftermath of the battle for Whiterun is perhaps the most disappointing aspect. You walk back outside, and the bodies are already being cleaned up, or they despawn. A few barricades remain, a few fires burn. But the city is largely unchanged. The destruction is just a few new static objects placed in the way to annoy you when you try to walk to the blacksmith. The dialogue of the guards changes to reflect the new management, but the soul of the city remains static. Heimska, the shouting priest of Talos, is either thrown in jail if Imperials win, or continues shouting if Stormcloaks win. Life goes on with terrifying speed. The Siege of Whiterun highlights the gap between the writer's intent and the engine's capability. It was supposed to be the turning point of history. Instead, it was a 20-minute radiant quest with a lot of fire particle effects. The Dragonborn, who can summon storms and call dragons, feels boxed in by the artificiality of it all. You didn't outmaneuver the enemy, you just outlasted the spawn timer. As the smoke clears and the new Jarl, or the old Jarl, sits on the throne, the realization hits. If this was the biggest battle the war has to offer, the rest of the conflict is going to be a long, quiet trudge. The spectacle of Whiterun was the peak. and it was barely a foothill. Now the war shifts away from the cities and into the forts, those copy-pasted stone blocks that litter the landscape, waiting for us to grind through them in a repetitive loop that will test our patience far more than our combat skills. The smoke over Whiterun has barely settled. The Jarl has surrendered, the guards have swapped their yellow uniforms for the red of the Empire or the blue of the Stormcloaks, and the Dragonborn stands victorious. You might expect, after such a pivotal battle, that the war would change in nature. You might expect deep espionage missions, diplomatic summits to sway undecided holds, or perhaps targeted assassinations of high-ranking officers. But as you return to your faction's camp, hidden in the crags of some godforsaken mountain range, Legate Ricker or Galmar Stonefist greets you not with a new strategy, but with a map marker. Welcome to the fort grind phase of the Civil War. If the battle for Whiterun was a cinematic disappointment, the subsequent campaign to conquer the remaining holds is a lesson in repetitive stress injury. The game sheds any pretense of narrative variety and settles into a rigid, mechanical loop that defines the middle chunk of this questline. You're no longer a hero weaving a tapestry of destiny. You're a factory worker on an assembly line of violence. The structure is maddeningly simple. You report to the camp. You're told, the enemy holds this fort, we need it. You travel to the fort. You meet a group of generic soldiers. You charge in. You kill enemies until a percentage counter on your screen drops from 100% to 0%. You win. You go back to camp. You do it again. Let's talk about that percentage counter. It is a core in-game fact that shatters immersion with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. When the battle for a fort begins, the game literally gamifies the lives of the soldiers. A HUD element appears, tracking the forces remaining. It doesn't matter if you execute a brilliant tactical flank. It doesn't matter if you snipe the commander. The only thing that matters is lowering that number. It reduces the complex horror of war to a loading bar. You find yourself mindlessly swinging your weapon, watching the red dots on your compass, waiting for the arbitrary number to hit 0 so the quest completed text can flash across the screen. It feels less like conquering a province and more like doing chores. The forts themselves, Fort Dunstad, Fort Greenwall, Fort Snowhawk, Fort Sunguard, begin to blur together into a singular grey mass of crumbling stone and snow. While the level designers at Bethesda did their best to give each location a unique layout, the copy-paste nature of the objectives renders these differences moot. Whether the fort is in the swamp of Morthal or the volcanic tundra of the Rift, the experience is identical. You run through a broken wall or a main gate. You fight in a courtyard. You maybe run up a rampart to kill an archer. There is no verticality to the strategy, no environmental hazards to exploit. It is a mosh pit in a stone box. There is a pervasive feeling of emptiness in these battles. You're told you are seizing a strategic stronghold, yet these forts are often smaller than the bandit caves you cleared at level 5. The garrison you are displacing consists of perhaps 20 men. The army you are leading is 3 guys who get stuck on the geometry of a wagon. The grand campaign map in the command tent shows flags moving back and forth, suggesting a dynamic shifting front line. But when you go to these locations, the reality is static. The war waits for you. If you don't show up to Fort Castav, the battle never happens. The soldiers just stand in the snow freezing, presumably playing cards until the protagonist arrives to press the start button. Here is an obscure lore tidbit that highlights the wasted potential of these locations. Take Fort Sunguard in the Reach. According to the in-game book The Reachmen, this fort has a bloody history of changing hands between the Nords and the Reachmen, the Forsworn. It sits on a strategic precipice, a fortress designed to be impregnable. In the lore, taking Sunguard should be a nightmare of climbing grappling hooks and dodging boulders. In the game, you just walk through the front door because the previous tenants left it unlocked. The game ignores the specific history of these places. A fort that was once a prison, or a fort built on an ancient burial ground, functions exactly the same as a fort built last Tuesday. The lore gives them personality. The quest script lobotomizes them. The repetition is so severe that seasoned players often zone out entirely. You enter a flow state of boredom. Swing, block, shout, loot, repeat. The dialogue barks of the soldiers loop endlessly. Is that all you've got? Skyrim belongs to the Nords. Die, Imperial dog. After the 5th fort, these shouts lose their ferocity and become white noise, blending with the sound of the wind and the clashing steel. You stop seeing them as people fighting for a cause and start seeing them as obstacles to your next perk point. The community has long debated the infinite spawn mechanics found in these battles. Unlike normal dungeons where enemies are finite, the fort battles use a spawner system to keep the 100% counter-feeding. Fans have pointed out the logical absurdity of this. Where are these men coming from? If the Legion is so short-handed that they can't patrol the roads, how are they teleporting fresh recruits into the courtyard of Fort Mole every 30 seconds? It leads to the fan theory that the Civil War is actually a population sink, a meat grinder designed by the gods, or the developers, to keep the population of Skyrim manageable. The Infinite War isn't a struggle for dominance, it's a mechanism of population control. Occasionally the game tries to mix it up. There is the mission to rescue prisoners from Fort Newgrad or Fort Castav, depending on your faction. This requires a modicum of stealth. You sneak in through a grate or a lake, find the prisoners, and release them to help you fight your way out. For a brief, shining moment, the game remembers it is an RPG. You feel like a commando behind enemy lines. But inevitably, once the prisoners are free, the stealth breaks and it devolves back into the standard courtyard brawl. The stealth option is just a prequel to the mosh pit. And let's not forget the glitch factor in these fort battles. Because the script is juggling so many NPCs, relative to the engine's comfort zone, things go wrong. Soldiers float in the air, corpses twitch and vibrate against the cobblestones. Sometimes the force counter bugs out, and you are stuck at 3% remaining wandering the empty fort looking for the one enemy soldier who spawned inside a wall. You can hear him shouting insults from within the masonry, a ghost in the machine preventing your victory. You have to use console commands or area of effect spells to kill the wall itself just to finish the quest. It is the ultimate anticlimax. This phase of the war also exposes the irrelevance of the Dragonborn's true power. You are the Dovahkiin. You could summon a dragon to burn the fort to the ground. You could call a storm that strikes every enemy with lightning. But the quest design is stuck in medieval soldier simulator mode. Even if you use Odafing or Durnafir, the script often doesn't account for them properly. The dragon might attack your own troops, or just fly circles around the towers without engaging. The game wants you to fight like a grunt, not like a demigod. As you capture the final fort in a hold, the Jarl is deposed. You travel to the capital city, stand in the Jarl's court, and listen to the same speech you heard in the previous hold. You are a disgrace. I will not surrender. Take him away. The names change. Sidgeir is replaced by Dengir, or vice versa, but the rhythm is identical. The political landscape of Skyrim is being reshaped by a template. The tragedy of the copy-paste fort battles is that they consume the majority of the Civil War's runtime. This is the meat of the questline, and it is tough, flavourless and overcooked. It wears the player down not through difficulty, but through monotony. You find yourself checking the quest log not to see what happens next, but to see how many more of these damn things you have to do before you can fight the final battle. By the time you have liberated the Rift, the Pale, Yalmarch and the Reach, the Dragonborn is tired. Not the weary from a hard-fought campaign kind of tired, but the I need to play a different game kind of tired. You have painted the map red or blue, but the paint is peeling. And as we prepare to move to the next section, we have to talk about the one moment where the game tried to pause this violence for diplomacy, and somehow made it even more tedious than the fighting. But let's say you tire of the endless fort battles. Let's say the Dragonborn decides that the impending apocalypse of Ulduin the World Eater is slightly more pressing than whether the Stormcloaks control a pile of rocks in the Yalmarch swamp. You decide to push the main questline forward. You need to trap a dragon in Dragon's Reach, but Jarl Balgruuf, ever the pragmatist, refuses to allow a fire-breathing monster into his wooden porch while the Civil War threatens his borders. I can't help you, he says, not while Ulfric and Tullius are at each other's throats. And thus we stumble into Season Unending, a quest that replaces the visceral, if repetitive, combat of the war with the one thing no high fantasy hero asks for, a bureaucratic board meeting. We ascend the 7,000 steps once more, not to learn the secrets of the Thuum, but to play marriage counsellor to two grown men who refuse to share their toys. The setting is High Hrothgar, specifically the council chamber, a room you might not even notice exists until this specific quest triggers. The atmosphere should be electric. You have the general of the Imperial Legion, the Jarl of Windhelm, the greybeards and the blades all in one room. This is the Yalta Conference of Tamriel. This is where history is written. In reality, it is a masterclass in awkward silences and dialogue trees that feel like filing tax returns. The Dragonborn sits at the head of the table. You are the mediator. But instead of using your charisma or your God-given voice to command submission, you are presented with a series of binary choices that boil down to trading property like it's a game of Monopoly. If I give you Markarth, you must give him Riften. It is a zero-sum game of swapping holds. The strategic value of these locations, the silver mines of Markarth versus the mead of Riften, is reduced to a hidden numerical value in the game's script. You aren't negotiating peace, you're balancing a math equation to make the NPCs stop yelling. The scene is dominated by the presence of Elenwen, the Thalmor emissary. Her arrival kicks off the first conflict of the meeting. Ulfric refuses to sit until she leaves, or stays depending on how much you want to annoy him. This is actually one of the few moments where the core in-game fact of the Thalmor's puppet mastery is put right in your face. Elenwen is there to ensure the war doesn't end, or at least that the truce is temporary. She is the physical manifestation of the game's geopolitical tension. But her role is largely passive. She stands in the corner offering snide remarks while you do the heavy lifting. The pacing of Season Unending is excruciatingly slow. The characters speak with the gravitas of tectonic plates, taking long pauses between sentences. And this brings us to the most dreaded enemy in this quest, the scripting bug. Veteran players know the terror of the High Hrothgar stare. There is a notorious glitch where, after a character finishes a line, the next character simply fails to respond. Galmar Stonefist stares at Rika. Rika stares at the Dragonborn. The greybeards stare at the wall. The wind howls outside. You can't stand up. You can't draw a weapon. You're trapped in a purgatory of polite silence, forced to reload a save from 30 minutes ago because the AI forgot whose turn it was to speak. It turns a tense negotiation into a surrealist play about waiting. When the dialogue does work, it highlights the pettiness of the leaders. We mentioned earlier that the war is supposed to be about deep ideological differences, Talos worship versus Imperial security. But at the table, it's about compensation. I want payment for the massacre at Karthwasten, Ulfric demands. Or Tullius demands the Pale. It feels less like a clash of civilizations and more like a divorce settlement. There is an obscure lore tidbit buried in the dialogue regarding that massacre at Karthwasten. If the negotiation goes a certain way, you get a rare glimpse into the actual brutality of the war that we never see on screen. Ulfric, or Galmar, mentions the incident at Karthwasten, where the Legion supposedly slaughtered civilians to secure the silver mines. The Empire denies it, calling it necessary enforcement. This dialogue implies a darker, bloodier war than the one we play. A war of war crimes and atrocities. It's a fascinating narrative crumb that suggests the writers knew the war was supposed to be horrific, even if they couldn't animate it. The disconnect between this described horror and the clean, bloodless swapping of cities at the table is jarring. The bureaucratic nightmare is further compounded by the Dragonborn's lack of true agency. You can favour one side, sure. You can give the Empire a massive advantage or hand the Stormcloaks half the map. But the outcome is always the same. A temporary truce. The war doesn't end, it just pauses so you can go kill a dragon. The moment Alduin falls, the truce dissolves, and the radiant quests resume. It renders the entire negotiation ultimately pointless in the grand timeline. It is a narrative cul-de-sac. The community has long held a debate about the greybeard betrayal inherent in this quest. Fans argue about whether Arngir and the greybeards are breaking their own monastic vows by hosting this meeting. The way of the voice dictates pacifism and non-intervention. They are supposed to worship the voice, not use it, or their prestige, to shape politics. By hosting the political summit of the century, are the greybeards selling out? Some fans theorise that Paarthurnax pushed them into it, realising that Alduin is the bigger threat. Others argue it proves the greybeards are hypocrites. It's a rich vein of lore discussion that gives the scene more weight than the gameplay actually delivers. Mechanically, the quest forces a reset of the world map. If you trade Markarth to the Stormcloaks, the guards change. Instantly. The Jarl changes. It's a bizarrely sterile transition. There is no scene of the Legion marching out and the Stormcloaks marching in. You just fast travel there later, and the flags are different. It emphasises the feeling that Skyrim is not a living world, but a stage set where the stagehands change the props while the curtain is down. Season Unending tries to be Game of Thrones. It wants to be a scene of high tension, where words are weapons, but the limitations of the dialogue system, where you just pick option A or option B, strip it of nuance. You don't feel clever for outmaneuvering Tullius. You just feel like you clicked the option that made the quest update. There is no persuasion check to make them hug and make up. There is no option to shout them both into submission, though many of us have tried using unrelenting force on the table just to see the goblets fly. The most frustrating part? The loot, or lack thereof. You settle the biggest political crisis of the era, and you get nothing. No amulet of the peacemaker, no unique sword, just the permission to use a spell to call a dragon to a porch. The reward is simply the removal of a roadblock. As the meeting adjourns and the leaders storm out muttering threats about how this isn't over, the Dragonborn is left alone in the cold hall. The wind whistles. The greybeards go back to meditating. You have successfully navigated the most boring hour of the Dragonborn's life. You have proven that even in a world of magic and dragons, nothing is more powerful or more tedious than a committee meeting, and perhaps that is the most realistic thing about it. War is hours of boredom punctuated by moments of terror. Season Unending provides the boredom in spades, but now that the truce is signed, however temporarily, and the main quest is presumably finished, or ignored again, we have to look at what was left on the cutting room floor, because the emptiness of the negotiation table is nothing compared to the emptiness of the game files, where the real civil war lies buried. We step away from the negotiation table at High Hrothgar, leaving the greybeards to their silence and the generals to their petty squabbles. As we descend the mountain, let's take a detour not through the physical landscape of Skyrim, but through the digital archaeology of the game itself. We are entering the realm of what could have been. To understand why the Civil War feels so hollow, why it swings between a bar fight and a board meeting, we have to look at the ghosts of cut content that haunt the game's code. If you have ever played Skyrim on a PC and browsed the Nexus modding community, you have likely seen mods with names like Open Civil War or Civil War Overhaul. These aren't just fan fiction, they are restoration projects. They are attempts to piece together a shattered vase using shards left in the game files by the developers. Because the truth is, the Civil War we got is a shadow of the Civil War that Bethesda intended to give us. The original design document for the Civil War was ambitious, bordering on revolutionary. In the Ghost version of Skyrim, the war was not a static series of quest markers. It was a dynamic, shifting simulation. The map was supposed to be alive. Territory was meant to change hands without the player's direct involvement. You could lose the war. Imagine that. Actually failing. In the released game, you cannot lose. You can only delay winning. But in the cut content, there were scripts for the enemy faction recapturing forts you had previously taken, pushing the front line back, and even laying siege to your faction's capital while you were off picking mountain flowers. The most heartbreaking loss, and perhaps the most awesome core in-game fact that never was, involves the recruitment of unconventional units. In the final game, you fight alongside standard Nords and Imperials, maybe a battle mage if you're lucky. But deep in the audio files, there are voice lines for recruiting giants. Yes, giants. The player was supposed to be able to approach these towering shepherds of mammoths and convince them to join the fray. Picture the scene. You're assaulting Fort Greenwall. The enemy has the walls locked down with archers. You signal, and a 12-foot giant lumbers out of the tree line swinging a club the size of a tree trunk, sending Imperial soldiers into the stratosphere. It would have changed the entire tactical landscape. Instead, the giants remain neutral, grumpy isolationists who only care about their cheese. But it wasn't just giants. The cut content suggests a system where you could recruit local militias, mercenaries, and even leverage your standing with other guilds. The Thieves Guild could have been used to sabotage supply lines. The Dark Brotherhood could have assassinated enemy commanders before the battle even started. The isolation of the quest lines, which we will touch on later, was not the original plan. Everything was meant to connect. Here is an obscure lore, tidbit dragged from the depths of the creation kit. There were entire phases of the war dedicated to the battle for the holds that were completely excised. In the retail version, you take a fort, and then you take the capital, usually by just walking in. but the files show plans for city-specific destruction. There are unused meshes and textures for a burning Markarth and a besieged Riften. The city gates were meant to be battered down. The streets were meant to be filled with barricades and rubble. If you look closely at the scripts for the Battle of Whiterun, you can see the remnants of this system. It is the only city that actually retains its siege state mechanics. The broken fences, the catapult fire. This was supposed to happen everywhere. Every major city was supposed to have a war state variant. So why was it cut? This brings us to the great community debate. The RAM limit theory versus the deadline theory. The prevailing wisdom among the fanbase is that the ambitious Civil War was the primary victim of the console generation gap. Skyrim was released in 2011 on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. These machines had 512 megabytes of RAM. To put that in perspective, the web browser tab you're using to listen to this script probably uses more memory than the entire console had available. The engine simply couldn't handle it. The creation engine, for all its charm, is held together by duct tape and prayers, tracking dynamic front lines, spawning hundreds of soldiers, calculating destruction physics for cities, and handling the AI for giants in a siege. It would have melted the hardware. The console certification process likely forced Bethesda to take a machete to the script. They had to prune the simulation down to a linear scripted rail ride to ensure the game didn't crash every time a catapult was fired. But there is another layer to the tragedy, the dialogue. If you dig into the unused voice files, you find lines that hint at a much more reactive world. Soldiers were supposed to recognize your rank. Commanders were supposed to discuss strategy with you. There is a cut feature where you could challenge the enemy commander to single combat to decide the battle, avoiding the bloodshed of the troops entirely. This is a purely Nordic concept, the old way of settling disputes. It fits the lore perfectly, yet it was scrapped. Instead, we have to kill every single soldier in the courtyard, every time. The ghost of the Civil War is also visible in the speech skill. In the final game, speech is mostly for getting better prices at merchants, but there are unused scripts suggesting you could induce mass surrender. If you were a high-ranking, terrifying dragonborn clad in Daedric armour, you could intimidate a losing garrison into laying down their weapons. This would have added a profound role-playing element, the merciful conqueror. In the shipped game, the enemies are suicidal lemmings who will attack you even when they are the last man standing against a demigod. One of the strangest remnants is the regional economy system. The mill owners and mine operators have dialogue about the war affecting their business, which made it into the game. But the actual mechanics of destroying mills or seizing mines to starve the enemy of resources were cut. You can find campaign tables in the command tents with flags on them. In the cut version, interacting with these maps was supposed to let you direct troops to these resource nodes. In the final game, the maps are just unresponsive furniture. You poke them and nothing happens. The existence of this cut content creates a phantom limb sensation for the player. You can feel where the features should be. When you become a legate or a stormblade, you feel like you should be able to give orders. When you see a patrol, you feel like you should be able to command them to follow you. The game gives you the title, but the code denies you the power. It is a sobering reminder that game development is a war of attrition against technical limits and release dates. The Civil War we play is the safe version. It is the version that works mostly on 2011 hardware. It is the version that ensured the game shipped on 11/11/11. But for those of us who dream of what Skyrim could have been, these ghosts are painful. We wander the empty fields of Whiterun Hold, imagining the giant-led battalions that never arrived, the burning sieges of Markarth that never happened, and the complex, dynamic war that was simplified into a game of capture the flag. The modders have done heroic work restoring some of this. But mods can only do so much. They are building on a foundation that was poured, set, and then partially smashed by the developers themselves. The ghosts of the cut content whisper to us that the Civil War was supposed to be the main event, the engine of the game's history. Instead, it became a side attraction, a hollowed-out shell of ambition. And as we leave the digital graveyard of deleted files, we turn our attention back to the living, or rather the living impaired. Because if the cut content represents the ambitious features that died, our next subject represents the characters who survived, only to suffer a fate worse than death. Eternal banishment to a basement with absolutely nothing to say. The forts have been burned, the flags have been swapped, and the Dragonborn has single-handedly redrawn the map of Skyrim. You have marched from the Rift to the Reach, displacing rulers who have sat on their thrones for decades. But have you ever wondered where they go? In a game with a realistic population simulation, you might expect executed leaders, or perhaps exiled rulers, fleeing to Cyrodiil to raise an army for a counterattack. You might expect them to be rotting in a dungeon. Instead, if you fight for the Stormcloaks and dismantle the Imperial hold on the province, you create what is unintentionally the funniest sitcom scenario in the entire Elder Scrolls franchise, the Blue Palace Basement Club. Let's set the scene. You travel to Solitude, the last bastion of Imperial rule. You enter the Blue Palace, a place of high culture, silk and court intrigue. You walk past the court of Jarl Elisif, head down the stairs and turn left into the guest quarters, essentially the palace basement. And there they are, the deposed Jarls of Skyrim, the former masters of the land, all crammed into a single hallway like college students sharing a dorm room during finals week. There is Jarl Siggeir of Folkreath, the corrupt, arrogant decadent who sold out his uncle. There is Jarl Igmund of Markarth, the man who struggled to contain the Forsworn. There is Jarl Idgrod Ravencrone of Morthal, the mystic who sees visions. They are all standing around, often staring at each other, or sleeping in beds that are uncomfortably close together. It is a core in-game fact that shatters the grandeur of the war. These aren't exiled monarchs plotting their return. They are discarded assets stored in a cell buffering zone because the game didn't know how to delete them. The vibe in this room is indescribably awkward. You, the person responsible for their homelessness, can walk right in. You might expect them to attack you. You might expect a cutscene where they curse your name and vow revenge. Instead, you get a single, generic bark of dialogue. Siggeir might sneer, "Fresh fruit and vegetables. I miss them." He's not lamenting the fall of the Empire, he's lamenting his diet. Igmund might grumble about the Stormcloaks, but he does so with the passive aggression of a man whose soup was served cold, not a man who lost a kingdom. The most jarring aspect is the dialogue stasis. Jarl Idgrod Ravencrone is one of the most interesting characters in the game. She has visions, she is wise, she knows things she shouldn't know. Yet, when placed in the basement of shame, she has nothing new to say about the cosmic implications of Ulfric's victory. She doesn't prophesy the doom of Skyrim. She just wanders the room, occasionally sitting in a chair, then standing up, then sitting down again. The AI packages for these characters seem to break down in confinement. They lose their daily schedules, their court holding, their strolls through town, and are reduced to Sandbox mode, which basically means wander randomly within a 10-foot radius. This leads to the obscure lore tidbit regarding the family dynamics that are completely ignored in this basement. Take the relationship between Siggeir and Dengir of Stune. Dengir is the Stormcloak uncle who replaces Siggeir. Siggeir betrayed his uncle to take the throne initially. Now that Siggeir is deposed, the bitterness should be palpable, but more interestingly consider Jarl Idgrod. She has a family, a husband and children. They often accompany her to the basement, so now you have not just the Jarls, but their entire families, stewards and housecarls, all loitering in the corridors of the Blue Palace. It creates a population density in the basement that rivals the marketplaces of major cities. It's a refugee crisis contained entirely within one luxury hotel wing. If you sided with the Empire, the dynamic is mirrored, though slightly less claustrophobic, in the Palace of the Kings. The deposed Stormcloak Jarls, Lila Lawgiver, Skuld the Elder, gather at the long table in Windhelm to sulk. Seeing Skuld the Elder, a man who constantly screams about the glory of Talos, forced to sit next to Layla, who mostly cares about the Thieves Guild ruining her city, is a comedic goldmine that the game refuses to tap into. They just eat bread. Endlessly. They eat bread and glare. It's the last supper of the rebellion, but it lasts forever and nobody says anything profound. The community has dubbed this phenomenon the Jarl storage solution. Fans have long debated why Bethesda chose this route instead of simply disabling the actors or having them executed. The prevailing theory is that they were kept alive for potential Radiant quests, or cut content that involved a counter-coup. There are traces in the code suggesting that holds could flip back, which would require the old Jarl to be reinstated. Because that system was cut, as we discussed in the previous section, the backup Jarls are left in digital limbo, waiting for a script trigger that will never fire. They are understudies for a play that has already closed. This creates a fan theory that the Blue Palace is actually a high-security prison in disguise. Think about it. They never leave. You never see Siggeir at the Winking Skeever trying to drown his sorrows. You never see Igmund trying to catch a boat to High Rock. They are physically incapable of leaving the cell. Is Elisif keeping them there? Is the Empire keeping them as hostages? Or is the nav mesh, the pathfinding data for AI, just not connected to the front door? The latter is the technical truth, but the former is the more disturbing headcanon. They are guests who are technically free, but functionally incarcerated by the geometry of the level. The lack of interaction between these roommates is the biggest missed opportunity. Imagine if you walked in and found them arguing. Imagine Idgrod lecturing Sidgeir on his lack of morals. Imagine the stewards forming a support group. Instead, they operate in isolation. You can stand in the middle of the room, jump on the table and shout, and they will all turn their heads in unison, say, "Need something?" and then go back to staring at the wall. It emphasizes that the Civil War didn't change their personalities or their stories, it just changed their GPS coordinates. Furthermore, their essential status remains. You generally cannot kill these deposed Jarls. The game protects them. Why? They have no role left to play. The war is over, or in the final stages, yet the plot armor remains thick. You can rain fire upon Sidgeir in that basement, and he will just take a knee, catch his breath, and get back up to complain about the fruit again. It robs the player of the ultimate closure, eliminating the tyrants they fought to overthrow. You didn't defeat the corrupt leadership of the Empire, you just inconvenienced them. You forced them to move into a slightly smaller apartment in a nicer city. The existence of the basement Jarls undermines the gravity of the High King narrative. If Ulfric, or Elisif, is the supreme ruler, why are these dissidents allowed to congregate? In a medieval setting, a deposed rival is a dangerous focal point for rebellion. They would be heads on pikes, or at least in the dungeon proper. By keeping them in the guest wing, the game implies that the Civil War is actually incredibly polite. It's a war of musical chairs. "Oh, you took Falkreath? Terribly sorry. I'll just pack my bags and go stay with Elisif. Let me know if you need the keys." It's also worth noting the clothing dissonance. They still wear their Jarl finery. They haven't been stripped of their rank visually. Seeing 6 people wearing the exact same high-poly Jarl's robes in one room looks like a cosplay convention gone wrong. It breaks the visual hierarchy of the world. Jarls are supposed to be unique, singular figures. When they are mass-produced and stored in a basement, they lose their aura of authority. They look like unsold merchandise on a clearance rack. As the Dragonborn leaves the Blue Palace, stepping out of the awkward silence of the basement and back into the bustling streets of Solitude, the feeling is one of bewilderment. You have toppled governments, you have shifted the balance of power, but the people you defeated are just downstairs, safe, sound, and bored. It reinforces the theme we keep returning to. The Civil War is a conflict without teeth. It barks, it postures, but it refuses to bite. And speaking of posturing without biting, we must now turn our eyes to the puppet masters. While the Jarls sulk in the basement playing checkers with their regrets, there is another faction that is watching the chaos with a delight that borders on erotic. We need to talk about the Dossier. We need to talk about the Thalmor, because if the Jarls are the losers of the war, we're about to find out who the real winners are. And spoiler alert, it isn't you, and it isn't the guy you just helped put on the throne. While the deposed Jarls are busy sharing bread and awkward silences in the basement, there is a group of individuals who are watching the Civil War not with fear or with patriotism, but with a cold, calculated smirk. We must turn our gaze from the snowy trenches of the north to the misty peaks of the northwest to the Thalmor embassy. Here, amidst the high society parties and the scent of lavender and treachery, lies the document that effectively renders the entire Civil War questline a tragic joke. This is the moment the narrative pulls the rug out from under you. Up until this point, the game has framed the conflict as a binary choice: the religious freedom and independence of the Stormcloaks versus the stability and law of the Empire. It's a classic freedom versus order debate. You pick a side based on your moral compass, but then, during the main quest, Diplomatic Immunity, you're asked to infiltrate the Thalmor stronghold. You hand your gear to a nervous wood elf named Malbon, you put on your party clothes, and you rub shoulders with the elite. Once you slip away from the party and sneak into the Solar, dodging wizard guards and looting potions, you find a chest. Inside that chest is a book. It isn't a spell tome, it isn't a skill book, it is a dossier. Thalmor Dossier, Ulfric Stormcloak. If you are the type of player who just mashes the take all button and keeps running, you might miss it. But if you stop to read it, the text hits you harder than a giant's club. This core in-game fact reveals that Ulfric Stormcloak is considered an asset by the Thalmor. Not an ally, crucially, but an asset. The document details that during the Great War, Ulfric was captured and interrogated by Elenwen herself. He was broken. He was made to believe that information he gave up was crucial to the fall of the Imperial city, a lie designed to crush his spirit. He was then allowed to escape. The dossier explicitly states, a Stormcloak victory is also to be avoided, however, so even indirect aid to the Stormcloaks must be carefully managed. The incident at Helgen is an example where an exception had to be made. Essentially, the ongoing war is the preferred outcome. Let that sink in. The ongoing war is the preferred outcome. The Thalmor, the big bad of the setting, the faction that everyone hates, wants you to fight this war. They don't want the Stormcloaks to win because a unified, independent Skyrim is a threat. They don't want the Empire to win because a unified Empire is a threat. They want the meat grinder. They want Nords killing Imperials and Imperials killing Nords until both sides are so bled white that the Dominion can simply walk in and take over without unsheathing a sword. This revelation turns the Civil War from a heroic struggle into a puppet show. The Dragonborn, thinking they are a liberator or a unifier, is actually just an unpaid intern for the Thalmor's foreign policy department. Every fort you capture, every soldier you slay, extends the chaos that benefits the elves. It creates a profound sense of nihilism around the questline. Why are we fighting for the Jagged Crown when the puppet masters are laughing at us from the balcony? Here is an obscure lore tidbit that deepens the tragedy of Ulfric's character. The dossier mentions that Ulfric became uncooperative to direct contact after the Markarth incident. This refers to the time immediately after the Great War when Ulfric retook Markarth from the Reachmen, demanding open Talos worship as his reward. The Empire agreed, then reneged under Thalmor pressure, leading to Ulfric's imprisonment. The tragedy is that the Markarth incident was likely orchestrated or at least capitalised on by the Thalmor to drive a wedge between Skyrim and the Empire. Ulfric, thinking he was standing up for his gods, was playing exactly the role Elenwen wrote for him. He is a tragic figure, a man driven by guilt and trauma, manipulated into starting a war that destroys the very land he claims to love. This leads to one of the fiercest debates in the Elder Scrolls community, the sleeper agent versus useful idiot debate. Some fans read the dossier and conclude that Ulfric is a traitor, a literal agent working for the Thalmor. They point to the direct contact line as proof of collusion. Others argue that asset in intelligence terms simply means someone you can manipulate. Ulfric doesn't know he's being used. He thinks he's fighting the good fight, which makes him a useful idiot. The community splits down the middle. Is he a villain or a victim? The game leaves it ambiguous enough to keep the forums burning for a decade. But regardless of his intent, the result is the same. The Civil War is a Thalmor project. The existence of this dossier also casts a shadow over the victory conditions of the war. If you side with the Empire and kill Ulfric, you technically harm the Thalmor's immediate plans by ending the distraction. However, you leave the Empire weakened and still bound by the White Gold Concordat, meaning the Thalmor justiciars can still roam Skyrim dragging people off to torture chambers. If you side with the Stormcloaks, you kick the Empire out, but you leave an independent Skyrim isolated with no navy, no Legion support, and a decimated population, ripe for a Dominion invasion that the dossier implies is coming eventually. There is no good ending. There is only the ending the Thalmor fear least. The presence of the dossier also highlights the disconnect between the main quest and the Civil War quest. You find this information halfway through the main story. Logically, the Dragonborn should be able to take this document to General Tullius or Ulfric. You should be able to walk into the Palace of the Kings, slam the book on the table and say, "Look, you are being played. Elenwen is laughing at you." You should be able to use your high speech skill to force a truce based on this common enemy. But you can't. The game doesn't allow it. You can show the dossier to Delphine, the Blade Leader, and she will nod and say, "Yes, the Thalmor are bad." And that's it. The document that proves the futility of the war becomes just another item in your inventory, buried under 50 cheese wheels and a dragon bone. You possess the truth that could stop the bloodshed, but the script forces you to keep silent and go back to capturing Fort Greenwall. It is a maddening instance of gameplay segregation, where the protagonist's knowledge exceeds the protagonist's ability to act. The Thalmor Embassy mission itself serves as a stark contrast to the mud and blood of the Civil War. It is clean, elegant, and quiet. It reinforces the idea that the real power in Tamriel isn't found on the battlefield, but in the shadows. The Thalmor don't fight in the Civil War, They attend parties, they drink wine, they casually discuss the torture of prisoners, while Galmar Stonefist and Legate Ricker are out in the freezing snow, screaming until their voices are hoarse. Elenwen is sitting by a fire reading reports on their progress like a stockbroker checking a ticker tape. The puppet show nature of the war explains why the stakes feel so low. The game, perhaps inadvertently, tells you that the Civil War is the B-plot. The A-plot is the conflict with the Thalmor, but that plot is never resolved in Skyrim. It is a cliffhanger left for the Elder Scrolls 6. We are fighting a proxy war. We are fighting in the Sandbox while the adults watch from the porch. Even the random encounters with Thalmor Justiciars on the road reinforce this. If you stop and talk to them, before inevitably killing them for their loot, they are smug, they are arrogant, they tell you openly that your heresy will be punished. They walk through Stormcloak territory and Imperial territory with equal impunity. The Civil War doesn't stop them. It barely slows them down. In fact, the chaos of the war gives them more cover to snatch people. A patrol of justiciars dragging a prisoner is a common sight, and the soldiers of the Civil War, red or blue, usually ignore them. The war for Skyrim somehow ignores the foreign death squads marching down the main roads. By the time you finish reading the dossier and escape the embassy through the reeking cave, a fitting exit considering the foul truth you just uncovered, the enthusiasm for the war effort drains away. Why bother taking the next fort? Why bother listening to another speech about Nord tradition or Imperial unity? It's all noise. It's all a distraction designed to keep humanity divided while the elves sharpen their knives. The narrative tragedy is that the Dragonborn, the ultimate power fantasy, is rendered politically impotent by a piece of paper. You can shout a dragon out of the sky, but you cannot shout the truth into the heads of the stubborn Jarls. You are forced to participate in the charade to clear the quest log. You become a willing participant in the Thalmor's game, simply because the game engine gives you no other way to resolve the conflict. As we leave the embassy behind with the bitter taste of truth in our mouths, we look back at the world we are fighting for. We look at the cities we have besieged, the forts we have taken, and we notice something strange. The fires we lit in Whiterun, they are still burning. The barricades we smashed, they are still smashed. The war might be a puppet show, but the damage it does to the world is frustratingly permanent. We are moving from the political futility of the war to the mechanical ugliness of it. Let's talk about the world that refuses to heal. We leave the Thalmor embassy behind, stepping away from the cold intellectual horror of the dossier and back into the physical reality of Skyrim. We fast travel back to Whiterun, the heart of the province, the trading hub that we liberated or defended several sections ago. You might expect, given that weeks or months have passed in-game since the Siege of Whiterun, that things have returned to normal. You might expect to see carpenters hammering nails, masons mixing mortar, and the good people of the hold putting their lives back together. Instead, you arrive at the main gate to find that the Dragonborn has apparently entered a universe where the concept of cleaning up does not exist. Welcome to the static world and permanent debris, the phase of the game where you realise that Skyrim's greatest enemy isn't the World Eater or the Thalmor, but a complete lack of municipal infrastructure maintenance. The state of Whiterun, after the Civil War battle, is a visual sore that never heals. The barricades that were erected for the siege, those spiked wooden chevaux de frise that block the path to the blacksmith, are still there. The fires that were lit during the assault are still burning. It has been 3 months, Jarl Balgruuf. Why is the hay bale still on fire? The persistence of this damage is not just an aesthetic annoyance. It is a constant nagging reminder of the game engine's limitations. The core in-game fact here is that the Civil War triggers a state change in the city's cell that simply swaps Whiterun Normal for Whiterun Civil War. And for some reason, the developers decided that Civil War is the permanent new normal. Every time you sprint from the main gate to War Maidens to sell your loot, you have to jump over the same broken barricade. You have to navigate around the same pile of rubble. It disrupts the muscle memory of the town. Whiterun is the player's home. Breeze Home is usually the first property we buy. To see the neighbourhood permanently trashed is genuinely irritating. It's like having a house party where someone breaks a window and instead of fixing it, the host just decides that broken window is the new interior design theme forever. Let's look at the specific tragedy of Heimska's house. During the battle, the annoying priest of Talos loses his home. It is crushed by a catapult shot. You can see the ruins next to the Gildergreen. This is a nice bit of dynamic destruction during the event, but afterward, the rubble stays. Heimskr moves into a small tent pitched inside the ruins of his own living room. He continues to scream his sermons every day, standing in front of the giant statue, sleeping in a tent next to the debris of his former life. Nobody helps him clear it. The Jarl doesn't send a crew. The companions, who live 30 feet away and are literally made of muscle, don't lift a finger. The static nature of the debris makes the NPCs look sociopathic in their indifference. This brings us to an obscure lore tidbit related to the game's scripting. There is actually a script in the creation kit labelled something akin to CWC Leanup. It implies that there was an intention to have the cities repair themselves over time, or perhaps after the war concluded entirely. However, due to the way the Civil War questline technically never fully resolves, the Radiant quests continue forever to suppress insurgents. The cleanup script often fails to trigger or is simply incomplete. The game is waiting for a peace state that never mechanically arrives. So the debris is caught in a loop of perpetual war readiness. The war is over, the treaty is signed, or the enemy is dead, but the barricades remain because the code is still waiting for a ceasefire order that was lost in the mail. The psychological effect of this is profound. It makes the world feel dead. A living world heals, grass grows back, wood is replaced. In Skyrim, damage is a permanent scar. It breaks the immersion of time passing. You can play for 3 in-game years, become the Archmage, the Listener and the Harbinger, and that one fire near the drawbridge will still be crackling away, defying the laws of thermodynamics and fuel consumption. It reminds you that you aren't in a world, you're in a level. The community has developed a fan theory to explain this, often called the economic collapse theory. The idea is that the Civil War, combined with the Dragon Crisis, has so thoroughly bankrupted the holds that they literally cannot afford the labour to fix a fence. The Jarls are spending every septim on guards and arrows. The reason Whiterun stays broken is that Balgruuf is destitute. He can't hire a carpenter because the carpenter has been drafted or eaten by a dragon. It's a depressing, gritty explanation for what is essentially a bug, but it fits the Dark Ages vibe of the setting. The other more humorous theory is the Union dispute. The Carpenters Guild of Skyrim is on strike until the Dragonborn retrieves a specific hammer from a Dwemer ruin. But nobody has given the quest yet. It's not just Whiterun. If you look closely at Solitude or Windhelm after their respective sieges, which we will discuss shortly, the damage there also tends to linger. The smoke emitters placed to simulate battle atmosphere sometimes forget to turn off. You'll be walking through the capital city of the Empire in Skyrim, the Jewel of the North, and there's just a random plume of black smoke rising from a perfectly intact stone wall. It's the visual equivalent of a glitching neon sign. This static debris also highlights the disconnect with the Hearthfire DLC. The Dragonborn can build a sprawling manor from scratch. We can buy lumber, mine stone, and forge nails. We can build a library, a trophy room, and a garden. We are the greatest architect in the province. Yet we cannot pick up a hammer and fix the fence next to the Gildergreen. The game gives us the mechanics of construction but restricts them to our own selfish little plots of land. We can build a palace in the swamp, but we can't help our neighbours clean up their front lawn. It reinforces the idea that the Dragonborn is separate from the world, an observer who can take but not truly give back to the infrastructure. Consider the repair quests that exist in other games. In Breath of the Wild you build a town. In The Witcher 3, the world changes states based on your actions. In Skyrim, the only state change is intact to broken. There is no restored. The narrative arc of the Civil War is supposed to be about restoring order for the Empire, or restoring honour for the Stormcloaks. But you can't restore a broken wooden pallet. The Restoration School of Magic is a valid skill tree, but apparently nobody in the Hold capitals has ever cast a spell to fix a pothole. The permanence of the debris also creates navigation issues for the AI. Guards will frequently walk into the barricades, moonwalking against the wood for seconds at a time because their pathfinding nodes tell them the road is clear, but the physical object tells them it isn't. You watch the valiant defenders of the city getting defeated by a stationary object. It turns the post-war city into a slapstick comedy routine. There is a sadness to the static world. It creates a feeling of stagnation. The war didn't bring a new dawn. It just brought a mess. And because the mess never goes away, the war never truly feels over. You're constantly living in the immediate aftermath. The adrenaline has faded, the loot has been sold, but the cleanup crew never arrived. This visual clutter serves as a constant metaphor for the Civil War questline itself, messy, unfinished, and abandoned by the developers in favour of other things. Just as the developers moved on to Fallout 4 or Starfield without patching the debris, the Jarls move on to their daily routines without fixing their cities. The player is left to wander through the ruins of a conflict that no longer matters, tripping over the leftovers of a script that fired 100 hours ago. And it's not just the cities, the forts we captured. They often stay in a weird limbo state. Bodies sometimes don't despawn. You can visit Fort Greenwall a month later and find the same Imperial soldier lying face down in the mud. The crows must be very full in Skyrim, or the bacteria very lazy. The world refuses to recycle its dead. It holds on to every mistake, every battle, every broken texture, forcing you to look at it until you install a mod that lets you delete items with a console command. As we prepare for the final battles, the assaults on the capital cities themselves, we must carry this knowledge with us. We know that whatever damage we cause in Solitude or Windhelm will likely be permanent. If we shatter a crate, that crate is history. If we burn a house, that house is gone. The stakes of the final battle are high, not because of the political fallout, but because we are about to permanently ruin the aesthetic of the two nicest cities in the game. The Dragonborn approaches the gates of the enemy capital, not just as a conqueror, but as the ultimate vandal, about to inflict a level of property damage that no insurance policy in Tamriel covers. So here we are, the end of the road. We have captured the forts, delivered the axes, sat through the board meetings and ignored the Thalmor Dossier. We stand now at the gates of the enemy capital, either the imposing stone walls of Solitude or the icy ancient ramparts of Windhelm. This is the crescendo. This is the moment the entire questline has been building toward. In any other game, this would be a multi-stage raid. You would expect to disable the city's defences, fight a unique boss monster guarding the gate, and perhaps navigate a collapsing city while dodging dragonfire. You expect the return of the king. What you get is essentially a hallway simulator with a lot of shouting. The final assault on the capital city, whether you're storming the Blue Palace or the Palace of the Kings, is mechanically identical to every fort battle you have fought up to this point, just with better wallpaper. The siege doesn't involve complex mechanics. You don't use siege engines, you don't command squads, you just run forward. The developers achieved the siege aesthetic by placing burning barricades across the main streets, effectively turning the open cities into linear corridors. You cannot take a side street to flank the enemy because a pile of burning furniture blocks your path. You are funneled, like cattle, directly into the meat grinder of the main avenue. If you are attacking Windhelm, the grim atmosphere does some heavy lifting. The snow is falling, the stone is grey and oppressive, and the narrow streets of the Stone Quarter feel claustrophobic. It fits the Last Stand vibe. But if you are attacking Solitude, the jewel of Imperial Skyrim, the illusion cracks. You run up the main ramp past the Winking Skeever, and the Grand Legion defending the capital is maybe 5 guys. The infinite spawn system is working overtime here, churning out generic guards who run at you and die instantly. It feels less like a desperate defense of an empire and more like a riot control exercise gone wrong. The core in-game fact that everyone remembers from this moment is the final confrontation in the throne room. You breach the doors of the palace, the loading screen fades, killing the tension immediately, and you step into the main hall. There, standing by the throne, is the enemy leader, General Tullius or Ulfric Stormcloak, flanked by their loyal lieutenant, Legate Ricker or Galmar Stonefist. The dialogue here is actually well written. There is a sense of resignation. So, this is it, they say. They don't run, they don't beg, they stand their ground. It is a moment of quiet dignity before the inevitable violence. But then the fight starts, and the dignity flies out the window. This should be the hardest boss fight in the game. Ulfric Stormcloak is a master of the voice. He shouted the High King to pieces, allegedly. General Tullius is a seasoned military commander from Cyrodiil, but in gameplay terms they are incredibly underwhelming. Ulfric might use unrelenting force on you once, knocking you across the room, which is admittedly funny, but then he draws a steel axe and charges you like a common bandit. His cooldowns are too long, his AI too basic. He doesn't chain shouts, he doesn't call reinforcements, he just squares up and gets shouted down by the Dragonborn. General Tullius is even worse. He's just an old man with a sword. He has no magical abilities, no shouts, and his armour, while gold and shiny offers him no special protection against a warhammer to the face. The true tragedy of this final room isn't the leader, it is the lieutenant, and this brings us to one of the most poignant fan theories and community debates in the game's history, the faith of Legate Rikke. If you play as a Stormcloak, you have to kill Legate Rikke. She is a Nord. She loves Skyrim. Throughout the questline, she constantly tells Tullius that he doesn't understand the Nords, that he needs to respect their traditions. She is the bridge between the Empire and the people. When you confront her in the Palace of the Kings, she refuses to stand aside. "I'm a soldier," she says. "I die with my general." But the detail that breaks the hearts of lore masters everywhere is her final breath. When you strike the killing blow, Rikke gasps, "Talos, be with me." This confirms the theory that Rikke, the staunchest defender of the Empire, is a secret Talos worshipper. She's fighting to preserve the Empire because she believes it is the only way to save humanity from the Thalmor, even if it means hiding her faith. Killing her feels wrong. It feels like a mistake. The game forces you to murder the most reasonable person in the room. On the flip side, if you are an Imperial, killing Galmar Stonefist is less tragic and more annoying, mostly because he's a grumpy racist bear of a man, but his loyalty to Ulfric is undeniable. He dies believing he is freeing his people. The obscure lore tidbit for this section concerns the aftermath of these deaths, specifically regarding Sovngarde. During the main quest, when you travel to Sovngarde to fight Alduin, you can actually meet the souls of the people you killed in the Civil War. If you killed Ulfric, he is there, wandering the mists. He has a heartbreaking line of dialogue. "Skyrim was betrayed. The blood of her sons spilled in doomed struggle. I cannot face them. I cannot face him." He expresses regret. He realizes in death that his war fed the World Eater. It adds a layer of cosmic redemption and tragedy to his character that you never see if you just finish the Civil War and stop playing. He isn't a hero in Sovngarde. He's a lost soul realizing he was a pawn. But back in the palace, the body is still warm. The leader is on their knees. This is the scripted execution scene. The game gives you a choice. Execute them yourself, or let your faction leader do it. Galmar will ask to kill Tullius. Ulfric will ask you to do it. It's meant to be a moment of empowerment. This is your victory, Dragonborn. But visually it's clunky. You swing your weapon, they ragdoll awkwardly, and the quest updates. There is no cinematic camera angle. There is no slow motion, just a physics object slumping over, and then the loot, or rather, the lack of it. You have just killed a general of the Legion or the High King of Skyrim. You expect a legendary weapon, a unique artifact, maybe the Sword of the Empire or the Stormcloak's Fury. Instead, Tullius drops his armour, which is unique to be fair but looks like gold-foil chocolate wrapping, and a generic levelled sword. Ulfric drops his clothes, which have 0 armour rating, and a steel war axe. That's it. The loot for ending the biggest conflict in the Fourth Era is worse than what you get from a random dwarven centurion. It emphasises the bland reality we started with. These men weren't gods. They were just NPCs with essential tags until the script said they weren't. There is a bizarre awkwardness immediately following the death. The surviving leader, Ulfric or Tullius, launches into a victory speech. But because you are still in the room with the corpse, the tone is jarring. Ulfric will turn to Galmar and say, "We need to secure the city," while stepping over Tullius's body like it's a piece of luggage. The emotional weight of the execution evaporates instantly as they switch back to administrator mode. If you are an Imperial, Tullius gives a speech that hints at the future. He mentions that he hates the Thalmor almost as much as the Stormcloaks do. "We are keeping our powder dry for the real war," he implies. It's a crumb of lore that suggests the Empire is preparing to fight the Dominion again. It validates the Empire choice for many players. You aren't submitting to the elves, you're biding your time. But again, it's just dialogue. You don't get a quest to go fight the Thalmor, you just get a pat on the back. If you are a Stormcloak, Ulfric's speech is about independence. He asks you to stand by his side as he addresses the soldiers outside. This leads to the balcony scene. You walk outside. The soldiers are gathered, all 6 of them that the engine can render. Ulfric gives a rousing speech. It's well acted. His voice actor, Vladimir Kulich, delivers the lines with thunderous charisma. But if you look closely at the crowd, the AI is usually bugging out. Soldiers are walking into walls or holding torches that are clipping through their heads. the grand address to the nation is being delivered to a handful of glitchy guards in a courtyard that is still on fire. This finale highlights the core issue. The Civil War has no dungeon. Every other major questline ends with a dungeon. The College of Winterhold has Labyrinthian, the Thieves' Guild has the Dwemer Ruin, the main quest has Skulldurfen, the Civil War has a city street you've walked down 100 times. There is no exploration. There is no discovery. It is just a straight line to a boss who is weaker than a frost troll. The anticlimactic nature of the siege is the ultimate betrayal of the player's time. You spent hours capturing forts, delivering messages, and navigating the political landscape, only to find that the war ends with a 10-minute skirmish. The Dragonborn doesn't feel like a conqueror. They feel like a janitor who finally cleaned up the last mess on the list. As the speech ends and the soldiers cheer, canned audio of a large crowd plays which sounds nothing like the five guys standing there, the quest, Battle for Solitude Windhelm, completes. You get a notification. You get a sum of gold that is trivial by this point in the game. And then, silence. The music fades. The war is over. But is it? As we will see in the next sections, the game doesn't really know how to handle peace. The war ends, but the mechanics of war linger like a bad smell. We have won the crown, killed the king, and listened to the speech. But as we step out of the city gates, we realise that the moots haven't happened. The Jarls are still in the basement, and the world is just as broken as it was an hour ago. The climax was a plateau, and now we are left on the flat grey plain of the postgame. The echo of the final victory speech fades. The bodies of General Tullius or Ulfric Stormcloak have been unceremoniously despawned or dragged into a corner by a physics glitch. The Dragonborn stands in the centre of the palace, perhaps expecting a cutscene to trigger. After all, the entire war was fought on the premise of legitimacy. The Stormcloaks fought to restore the ancient Nord tradition of the moot, the gathering of the Jarls to elect a High King. The Empire fought to secure the throne for Elisif and uphold the rule of law. Both sides have spent hours of dialogue hyping up this political event, and so, we wait. We wait for the Jarls to arrive. We wait for the Great Council to convene at High Hrothgar or the Palace of the Kings. We wait to cast our vote, or at least watch the ceremony. We are still waiting. The moot that never happens is the narrative black hole of the Civil War. It is the promised resolution that the game simply refuses to deliver. Throughout the questline, you are told that the war is just the precursor. The real decision, the legal binding of the province, happens at the moot. Ulfric himself, if victorious, refuses to accept the title of High King immediately. He explicitly states, "I cannot accept the mantle of High King, not until the moot declares that title should adorn my shoulders." It is a moment of surprising humility and adherence to tradition. But because the script for the moot does not exist, Ulfric enters a state of permanent political limbo. He stands in the Palace of Kings day after day, waiting for a meeting that the developers never programmed. He is the High King-elect of a kingdom that has forgotten to hold the election. If you side with the Empire, Elisif is in the same boat. She is the presumptive High Queen, but without the moot, her title is technically just Jarl of Solitude with a lot of backup. The absence of this event robs the ending of its closure. In the lore, a moot is a momentous occasion. The Pocket Guide to the Empire describes historical moots as raucous, contentious affairs that could last for weeks. It is where the distinct personalities of the holds clash. Imagine a scene where the newly installed Jarls, Dengir, Sorley the Builder, Vignar Greymane, gather around a table. Imagine the tension as they formally cast their lots. It would be the perfect opportunity to show the new political landscape you created. It would validate the Jarl swapping mechanic we discussed earlier. Instead, the game leaves Skyrim in a permanent interregnum. Mechanically, there is no High King. The Jagged Crown we fetched in Section 3, it sits in a chest somewhere, unworn. The core in-game fact here is that if you ask Ulfric or Elisif about the moot after the war, they will say it is happening soon or in due time. This soon is the same soon that parents use when they promise a trip to Disneyland that they haven't booked. It is a brush-off. This leads to the puppet moot community. Theory. Fans argue that the reason the moot isn't shown is because it is a sham. If Ulfric wins, he has installed loyalist Jarls in every hold. If the Empire wins, they have done the same. The vote is 9-0 either way. It is a foregone conclusion, as Ulfric admits. Therefore, the theory goes, the game skips it because it's just a rubber stamp formality. But even a rubber stamp ceremony has value in a role-playing game. We want to see the coronation. We want to see the crown placed on the head. We want the visual payoff. The lack of a moot also creates a weird disconnect with the Dragonborn DLC. When you travel to Solstheim, the guards there might comment on the war's end, but the political reality of Skyrim feels distant and undefined. You are the hero of a war that ended in a question mark. Did the moot happen off-screen while you were fighting Mirak? Did they forget to invite you? The Dragonborn, the person who literally won the war for them, is excluded from the political process entirely. This omission highlights the rush to finish the game. It feels like the developers looked at the calendar, saw the 11/11/11 release date approaching and said, you know what, let's just have them give a speech and call it a day. The complex political manoeuvring promised by the lore is sacrificed for a simple, mission-accomplished banner. And so, the Civil War ends not with a bang, and not even with a whimper, but with a scheduling conflict. The Jarls never meet, the king is never crowned. And the Dragonborn walks away from the palace, leaving the rulers to wait for an event that will only happen in their fan fiction. The Jarls are waiting for their imaginary moot. The debris is burning eternally in the streets of Whiterun, and the Dragonborn has left the palace. You might decide now is the time to check in on your other responsibilities. After all, you aren't just a soldier. You're likely the Archmage of Winterhold, the Guildmaster of the Thieves Guild, the Listener of the Dark Brotherhood, and the Harbinger of the Companions. You are the CEO of Skyrim Inc. Surely the massive province-shattering war you just concluded has sent shockwaves through these organisations. Surely the political landscape has shifted the way they do business. Welcome to the phenomenon of law segregation, or as I like to call it, the solipsistic guild halls of Skyrim. One of the most jarring aspects of the Civil War is how politely it refuses to interact with the rest of the game. It is a polite neighbour that stays on its side of the fence, never asking to borrow sugar from the main plot or the faction questlines. Take the College of Winterhold, for instance. Winterhold is a city that has been decimated by the Great Collapse. It is barely holding on. You would think that the Civil War would be a massive deal here. The Stormcloaks distrust magic. The Empire tries to regulate it. The Thalmor, in the form of Ancano, are literally inside the college, spying on the Eye of Magnus. Yet, the war never comes to the bridge. You can have a raging battle for the hold of Winterhold, where men die in the snowdrifts of the town, and the college scholars will just keep staring at their enchanting tables. Mirabelle Irvine mentions the war in passing, saying, "We try to stay neutral." This core in-game fact of neutrality is the writer's convenient excuse to avoid programming complex interactions. The college exists in a bubble. The Archmage can be a Stormcloak general, yet Ancano, a Thalmor agent, walks past you in the Hall of the Elements without so much as a sneer about your political affiliation. The tension is non-existent. Then we have the Thieves Guild in Riften. This is perhaps the most egregious missed opportunity. The guild thrives on chaos. A civil war is a profiteer's dream. Smuggling weapons, stealing supplies, selling information. The guild should be the shadow broker of the conflict. And if you side with the Empire, Maven Blackbriar, the guild's patron, becomes the Jarl of Riften. This should be a massive win. The guild should effectively run the hold openly. Instead, life in the Ratway remains dank, wet, and unchanged. Brynjolf doesn't give you special, war-profiteering, radiant quests. Delvin Mallory doesn't ask you to steal battle plans. Even when Maven takes the throne, she treats you with the same haughty disdain she always has, despite the fact that you, the guild master, are technically the reason she has a throne to sit on. The synergy between Imperial victory and Thieves Guild dominance is implied in the lore but absent in the mechanics. The guild feels like a hermetically sealed aquarium, oblivious to the ocean storm raging outside the glass. But the wildest disconnect comes from the Dark Brotherhood. Spoiler alert for a 14-year-old game, the Dark Brotherhood questline ends with the assassination of Emperor Titus Mede II. You climb aboard his ship, the Kataria, and you kill the ruler of the Tamrielic Empire. This is an event of cataclysmic proportions. In the real world, if the Emperor was murdered in Skyrim, the Civil War would change instantly. The Legion's morale would shatter, or perhaps they would go into a frenzy of revenge. The Stormcloaks would celebrate it as divine intervention. In the game, nothing happens. You can kill the Emperor on Tuesday and report for duty to General Tullius on Wednesday. Tullius, the man whose supreme commander you just murdered, will look you in the eye and say, Good work taking that fort auxiliary. He doesn't mention the Emperor. He doesn't seem to know the death of the head of state is treated with less gravity than the theft of a sweet roll. There is an obscure lore tidbit regarding the Emperor's ship, the Cateria. It is actually one of the few locations that accounts for the war state, geographically. If Solitude is under siege or controlled by Stormcloaks, the ship anchors slightly differently, or the dialogue of the sailors shifts minutely to reflect the danger. But the quest itself doesn't branch. You can be the Stormblade, the literal champion of the rebellion, and the Emperor will still talk to you calmly, asking for a final request. He doesn't say, "Oh, it's you, the traitor." He treats you as a generic assassin. The game fails to recognize the delicious irony of the enemy general performing the assassination. This isolation leads to the companions' hypocrisy debate in the community. The companions of Whiterun claim to be apolitical mercenaries. We fight for honour, not for jarls. Yet their history is tied to Isgramor, the ultimate Nord hero. Many members, like Vignor Greymane, are vocal Stormcloak supporters. When the battle for Whiterun happens, the companions shut their doors. They don't help defend the city that has hosted them for thousands of years. They sit inside Jorvaskr, drinking mead, while the walls crumble. Fans argue whether this is true neutrality or cowardice. Mechanics-wise, it's just to prevent quest NPCs from dying, but narrative-wise, it makes the legendary warriors look like they are hiding under the bed. The lack of cross-faction impact makes the Dragonborn feel like they are suffering from multiple personality disorder. In one questline, you are a devout Imperial soldier. In another, you are killing the Imperial Emperor. In another, you are ignoring both to chase butterflies for the college. The game doesn't enforce consistency. You're never forced to choose between your loyalty to the guild and your loyalty to the army. Imagine a version of the game where your faction choice mattered. If you were a Stormcloak, maybe the Thieves Guild questline becomes harder because Mjol the Lioness, who hates the guild, gains influence with the new regime. If you were an Imperial, maybe the Dark Brotherhood contract is cancelled, or becomes a suicide mission because the Legion tightens security. Instead, we get the theme park approach. Each attraction is separate. The horror house doesn't affect the roller coaster. This segregation diminishes the Civil War from a world-encompassing event to just one of the things you can do. It is on the same level as collecting 20 Jazbay grapes. It doesn't bleed into the fabric of the society. The bards in the Bards College don't compose new songs about the current battles, they just sing the same two scripted songs. The temples don't fill with refugees. As we approach the final section of our analysis, we have to look at the cumulative effect of all these failures. The static world, the hollow ending, the isolated factions. We have to ask, what was the point? When the dust settles and the guards change colour, what have we actually accomplished? The answer, as we will see, is a profound and melancholy not much. And so, we arrive at the end of the timeline. The treaties have been burned, the battles fought, the speeches given. The Dragonborn walks the streets of a pacified Skyrim. But as the days turn into weeks, and the weeks into months, a sinking realization begins to take hold. You look around at the world you have ostensibly saved, and you realize that the prize for victory is a palette swap. The most immediate and visible consequence of your crusade is the uniforms. If you sided with the Empire, the distinctive blue of the Stormcloaks is gone, replaced by the leather and steel of the Imperial Legion. If you sided with Ulfric, the red tunics vanish, and the guards now sport the quilted vests and chainmail of the rebellion. They have new lines of dialogue. Smart man, joining up with the Legion, they might say, or Hail Stormcloak. It is a validation of your choice, a little audio pat on the back. But scratch the surface of this new regime, and you find that the new Skyrim is identical to the old Skyrim, just with different management. The roads are not safer. The bandits still occupy Valtheim towers. The necromancers still practice their dark arts in Ilinalta's deep. The dragons still fall from the sky with annoying regularity. The peace that was promised is not a cessation of violence. It is merely a monopoly on who gets to wear the badge while committing it. This brings us to the core in-game fact regarding the insurgency. The war mechanically cannot end. Even after the final battle, the enemy faction maintains camps hidden in the hills of every hold. You can visit these camps, you can slaughter the soldiers there, but you will find that the commander, the legate or the Stormcloak officer, is flagged as essential. You cannot kill them. They will fall to their knees, crawl around for a bit, and then stand up to attack you again. The game engine requires these camps to exist to spawn random encounters of enemy patrols so that the player still has something to fight on the roads. The narrative says total victory, but the mechanics scream perpetual guerrilla warfare. You haven't ended the war, you've just driven it into the bushes. The political changes are equally disheartening when examined closely. We traded Jarls, but did we trade up? In Riften, an Imperial victory installs Maven Blackbriar as the Jarl. We replace an incompetent but generally well-meaning Layla lawgiver with a ruthless crime lord who openly treats the city as her personal piggy bank. In Markarth, a Stormcloak victory installs Thongvor Silverblood, a man whose family is responsible for the exploitation of the Reach and the Sidna mine conspiracy. We are often swapping incompetence for malice, or vice versa. The banners change, but the suffering of the common folk remains a constant variable. The only tangible, world-altering difference involves religion. If the Stormcloaks win, the shrine to Talos in Whiterun is restored, and Heimskr is allowed to preach, loudly, without fear. If the Empire wins, the shrine is removed, and Heimskr is thrown in the Dragon's Reach dungeon. This is the one area where the player's choice has a definitive, binary impact on the rights of the citizens. But even this feels hollow when you realise that just outside the city walls, the Thalmor are still patrolling, still kidnapping people, and still plotting. The return of Talos worship is a moral victory, but a strategic liability that the game never resolves. This leads us to the obscure lore tidbit concerning the Civil War Champions content from the Creation Club, now integrated into the Anniversary Edition. Even in this official, add-on content designed years later, the conflict is reduced to a duel between two champions. It reinforces the idea that the war is a sport. But more interestingly, there is cut dialogue and developer notes suggesting that a second Great War was always the intended real consequence. The victory in Skyrim was never meant to be the end. It was meant to be the prelude to a continent-spanning conflict with the Dominion. Because that conflict isn't in the game, our victory feels like the first act of a play where the theatre catches fire before Act 2 can begin. The community has spent the last decade debating the canon ending theory. Fans argue passionately about which side is the canon victor for the purposes of the Elder Scrolls 6. The cynical and likely correct consensus is that Bethesda will pull a warp in the West, a phenomenon from Daggerfall where all endings happen simultaneously, or simply gloss over it by saying, the Civil War weakened Skyrim, and then the Empire collapsed anyway. The Dominion invaded. The fear is that our choice, the one we spent 20,000 words analysing tonight, will be rendered moot by a single line of exposition in the next game. During the chaotic years of the Fourth Era, the history book will read, erasing our efforts with a vague generalisation. The ultimate tragedy of the Civil War questline is that it fundamentally misunderstands the fantasy of the Dragonborn. We are a being of myth, a hero who shouts at time itself. We are designed to slay gods and traverse dimensions. To shackle such a character to a mundane, gritty, low-tech political dispute was always going to result in friction. We are too big for this war. We are a nuclear weapon trying to settle a bar tab. The game tries to ground us to make us a soldier, but it only succeeds in making the war feel small. As you stand on the throat of the world, looking down at the province one last time, you see the smoke still rising from the static fires. You see the patrols walking their scripted paths. You see a world that is beautiful, broken, and completely indifferent to your victory. You realise that the Civil War wasn't Skyrim's worst quest because it was hard, or because it was buggy, though it was certainly that. It was the worst quest because it promised us that we could change the world, and then, after all the blood and snow, it simply refused to let us leave a mark. The guards wear different colours now, that is all. And perhaps, in the frozen, stoic philosophy of the Nords, that is the only lesson that matters. Kings rise and fall, empires crumble, but the snow keeps falling, and the wheel keeps turning, utterly unconcerned with the colour of the flag flying over the tower. Now let the noise of the battle fade. Let the clashing of steel and the shouting of men drift away into the silence of the night. We are done with war. We are done with politics. The dossier is closed, the sword is sheathed, and the map is rolled up and put away. Take a deep breath. Can you hear it? The wind howling through the peaks of the throat of the world. It's a cold sound, but there is a comfort in it. It's the sound of a world that is ancient and enduring. Picture yourself in a warm tavern, maybe the Sleeping Giant in Riverwood or the Candlehearth Hall in Windhelm. The fire is crackling in the central hearth, casting dancing shadows on the heavy wooden beams. The smell of roasted meat and dried herbs fills the air. Outside, the snow is piling up against the door, burying the world in a blanket of soft white silence. But inside, you are warm, you are safe. The Dragonborn has earned their rest, and so have you. The roads of Skyrim are long and treacherous, but you don't have to walk them tonight. You can let the controller drop from your hands. You can let the worries of the Empire and the Stormcloaks dissolve like mist in the morning sun. There are no more forts to capture. There are no more messages to deliver. The quest log is empty. Imagine the Aurora Borealis shimmering overhead, ribbons of green and purple weaving through the stars. It watches over you, a silent guardian in the velvet night. Your breathing slows, your eyelids grow heavy. The journey is over for now. The world will wait for you. The mountains will wait. Sweet dreams.